Imagine being told from birth that you are not merely human, that you are divine, that your blood is not red but sacred, your breath not mortal but celestial. Now imagine growing up believing it. Surrounded by servants who bow instead of speak, priests who whisper prayers to your name, and courtiers who tremble when you look at them, not because they respect you, but because they fear what happens when gods bleed. This is the story of a child who was never allowed to be human, and who, in his final hours, screamed like one. The boy was named Ptolemy 15 Philopator Philometor Caesar, though history remembers him by a far simpler name, Caesarion, Little Caesar. The son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar, he was born not just into royalty, but into legend. His birth was hailed as a miracle, a symbol of divine union between Rome and Egypt, between God and goddess. The people of Alexandria didn't see him as a prince. They saw him as the living son of Isis and Jupiter himself. Cleopatra knew the power of symbols better than any ruler of her time. When she introduced her son to the Egyptian court, she didn't present a child. She unveiled a god. Draped in gold, carried on a litter of ivory, the infant Caesarion was paraded before the people as the reincarnation of Horus, the falcon-headed deity, son of Isis. Priests burned incense until the air turned white. Drums thundered, and the queen stood beside her son, eyes gleaming, as the crowd chanted in one voice, "Behold, the divine child, ruler of heaven and earth." But behind that spectacle, something darker stirred. Rome, the empire that had once crowned his father, was watching. Julius Caesar's death had left a power vacuum wider than the Nile, and Mark Antony, Cleopatra's new lover, was locked in a deadly struggle with Caesar's adopted son, Octavian. Both men claimed the right to rule, and both men claimed the favor of the gods. But only one of them had a living child who could claim descent from both Caesar and Isis. That child was Caesarion. As he grew, the weight of divinity crushed the boy beneath it. Cleopatra's palace at Alexandria was a world of gold and lies. Walls painted with celestial stars. Pools reflecting torchlight like shifting constellations. Every surface designed to remind him that he was not mortal, that he was destined to rule both east and west. Servants addressed him as Pharaoh of the two lands. Priests kissed his feet. Even his tutors, philosophers brought from Athens and Rome, were forbidden from addressing him, without titles fit for the gods. But the boy was still just that, a boy, pale, frail, uncertain. There are fragments of letters written by Roman envoys describing him as nervous and melancholic, prone to silence, staring for hours at the Nile from his balcony. The people adored their living god. The god himself lived in quiet fear. Cleopatra fed that illusion because she needed it. Her empire was crumbling, her enemies circling. By calling her son divine, she was trying to build an armor of myth around her dynasty. The goddess Isis and her child Horus reborn. But power like that draws predators. Octavian saw the threat clearly. A boy born of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar was not just a rival heir. He was a living symbol that could undo everything Rome had fought for. Caesarion was proof that Caesar had another legitimate line, one that could claim both the Egyptian throne and the Roman legacy. So while Alexandria sang songs of the divine child, Rome whispered a different prophecy, one that would end with a blade. By the time Caesarion turned 16, the world around him was collapsing. The marble halls that once echoed with divine chants now trembled with the distant rumble of war. The fleets of Mark Antony and Cleopatra had sailed to meet Octavian in a final, desperate battle for supremacy, and lost everything. The Battle of Actium, 31 BCE, ended not with glory, but with smoke and silence. When word reached Alexandria, Cleopatra did what all mortals do when the illusion of power dies. She hid. The Queen of Egypt, once radiant and untouchable, began to weave a different kind of myth, one built on survival. But for Caesarion, survival wasn't an option. The priests still called him son of the sun, but he was beginning to understand that the sun was setting. His mother's courtiers whispered in corners. Roman gold flowed into Alexandrian hands. The great city of learning, of temples and perfumes and luxury, felt like a coffin sealed in incense. The boy who had been told he was divine now sat in silence, listening to the muffled echoes of a dying empire. When Antony returned, broken, defeated, half a ghost, Cleopatra tried to revive the illusion. She adorned her palace with the trappings of ritual. Perfume filled the halls again. Musicians played in trembling hands. "The gods are testing us," she told her son. "They wish to see if we are worthy of the throne." But Caesarion had begun to see the cracks. The marble floors were streaked with blood from skirmishes in the streets. Servants whispered prayers not to Isis, but to Rome. And then Antony was gone, dead by his own hand. Cleopatra locked herself in her mausoleum, the grand stone tomb she had built as both monument and escape. She sent messages to Octavian, pleading for her children's lives. And for the first time in his life, Caesarion, the godchild of two empires, realized what his mother feared most. Not the death of her kingdom, but the humiliation of her son. When Octavian's legions entered Alexandria, they didn't march as conquerors. They marched like executioners. Banners of Rome fluttered in the wind. Bronze shields caught the Egyptian sun. The people who once chanted for their divine boy king now knelt before new gods, men of steel, not myth. Cleopatra tried to negotiate. She sent treasures, promises, words wrapped in silk and poison. But Octavian wanted one thing, and one thing only, the end of her bloodline. Ancient records suggest Cleopatra attempted to send Caesarion east, toward Nubia or India, disguised among merchants. But the boy hesitated. For years, he had been told he was divine, destined to rule the heavens and the earth. Gods do not run. And so he stayed. That hesitation sealed his fate. Cleopatra's final act became legend. The serpent, the basket of figs, the pale arm fallen beside gold jewelry, an image frozen in history. But while poets mourned the queen's death, her son was still alive, still trapped in the ruins of Alexandria. When Octavian's soldiers finally found him, Caesarion was not a god. He was a trembling teenager in linen robes, hiding behind temple pillars that smelled of dust and blood. Ancient historian Cassius Dio wrote that Octavian spoke kindly to the boy, promising him safety. It was a lie. Caesarion was taken to a Roman tent outside the city, unarmed, barefoot, silent. One of Octavian's advisors, Arrius Didymus, reportedly whispered, "Too many Caesars is not good for Rome." And with that, the son of Julius Caesar and Cleopatra was led away. His last words were never recorded. Only the screams that echoed from the desert wind, somewhere beyond the edge of Alexandria, where gods learned what it meant to die as men. In the days after Caesarion's death, Alexandria fell eerily silent. The city that had once worshipped a living god now whispered prayers for his soul, quietly, secretly, as if afraid that even mourning him might be considered treason. The Romans moved quickly. Octavian, ever the master of image, understood that killing a child god required more than a sword. It required a story. So he rewrote one. The official version spread like fire through Rome's messengers and marble halls. Cleopatra's son had died mercifully, swiftly, out of necessity. Rome could not afford to let a boy raised as divine claim his father's throne. Octavian had not murdered a child. He had restored peace. It was the first great act of propaganda in the new Roman Empire, and it worked perfectly. In Egypt, however, the story that survived was far darker. Rumors whispered that Caesarion was strangled, not by soldiers, but by Roman priests. That his body was not buried, but burned in secret, his ashes scattered into the desert to erase all trace of divinity. Others claimed he was taken to Rome itself, displayed before Octavian, who looked upon the trembling boy and uttered the words, "Two Caesars are too many." Then, with a gesture, ended the bloodline of the greatest ruler the world had ever known. But even that may not be the full truth. Some accounts, buried in obscure papyrus fragments, hint that Caesarion was tortured, not for confession, but for symbolism. The Romans wanted to make sure no one ever mistook him for a god again, that the boy who had been worshipped as Horus, son of Isis, would die in a way that stripped him of all sanctity. They broke him down until he screamed, and then they called it justice. And yet, History has a strange way of keeping the divine alive. After Octavian's triumph, he paraded through Rome with Cleopatra's effigy chained in gold, a symbol of conquest. But her son's image haunted him. Across Egypt, statues of Horus and the child gods were quietly repainted. The faces softened, the eyes larger, more sorrowful. Mothers whispered to their sons that the god-child had not died. He had ascended. Caesarion, they said, had become Osiris reborn, the eternal one who judges kings. It was blasphemy, but it spread. In temples long forgotten, priests carved secret hieroglyphs in chamber walls, hiding them from Roman eyes. One inscription found centuries later reads, "He was not slain by men. He was taken by the gods, screaming their names." For Octavian, later crowned as Augustus, the death of Caesarion was both victory and curse. The young emperor consolidated his power, reshaping Rome into an empire under divine rule, his rule. But he had murdered the very boy whose existence had once proven divinity's danger. And to secure his empire, Augustus adopted the same godlike imagery his enemy once used. He became the son of a god, Divi Filius. The irony was perfect. The godchild was dead, yet his murderer wore his crown of myth. Egypt fell silent under Rome's shadow. The temples of Isis were stripped of gold, the priests executed or enslaved. The cult of the divine boy was driven underground, whispered only in lullabies and funeral prayers. But the myth refused to die. Centuries later, travelers in the desert claimed to see a pale youth standing among the dunes, clothed in white linen, his eyes burning like the sun. Others spoke of strange wails at night near the ruins of Alexandria, not wind, but the screams of a child echoing through stone tombs. The boy who became a god had died screaming, but his voice somehow still carried, a ghostly reminder of what happens when human ambition tries to touch the heavens. Years after Caesarion's death, the sands of Egypt covered the ruins of his palace, but not his shadow. The boy who was once worshipped as Horus reborn had become something else entirely, a forbidden memory, a ghost at the crossroads of divinity and empire. Rome may have erased his name from official records, but they could never truly bury the myth Cleopatra had crafted. It began quietly, as all dangerous ideas do. In the backrooms of broken temples and the homes of loyal priests, people whispered that the child god had not died at all. They said Rome had only killed his mortal shell, while his divine essence fled into the heavens. Some even claimed his spirit entered the stars themselves, that the constellation Horus burned brighter after his death. Mothers began praying to him for protection over their sons. Women unable to conceive offered small clay effigies of a weeping boy to the Nile. The cult of Caesarion, though never officially named, began to grow like fungus in darkness. Meanwhile, in Rome, Octavian, now Augustus, turned that same divine imagery into the cornerstone of his empire. He declared himself Divi Filius, the Son of God, mirroring the same theology that had once crowned Caesarion. He built temples to his own divinity, minted coins with radiant halos, and inscribed his victories beneath symbols of the sun. Augustus had stolen the godhood of the child he murdered, but the people never forgot which god had come first. Archaeologists centuries later would uncover strange artifacts buried under Roman temples in Egypt. Statuettes of a young man with both Roman and Egyptian features, holding a serpent in one hand and a broken crown in the other. His face was serene, yet beneath the cracked paint, a faint carving remained, the divine child who died screaming. In a way, Caesarion's story was never truly about one boy. It was about humanity's obsession with divinity, and how easily power corrupts it. Cleopatra had wrapped her son in myth to secure her throne. Octavian had destroyed that myth to build his own. In both, the boy was a pawn, exalted, used, discarded. That cycle would repeat across centuries. In the Middle Ages, Christian chroniclers, interpreting ancient sources through their own theology, compared Caesarion's death to that of the holy innocents, the children slaughtered by King Herod. To them, Caesarion was both blasphemy and prophecy, a pagan echo of Christ, a godchild killed by earthly power. Some even suggested that his death inspired the later imagery of the martyred divine child, which persisted across cultures and faiths. In medieval manuscripts, his story reappeared under different names. A young king born of the moon and sun. A child who could command the rivers, but was drowned by men. Always divine, always betrayed. The myth of Caesarion had outlived his body. Even today, when archaeologists walk the ruins of Alexandria, they sometimes unearth fragments of broken reliefs. A child's face with large eyes, half effaced by time. To the untrained observer, it's just another relic. But to those who know the story, it feels like something more. A reminder that beneath every empire, beneath every god-king and holy ruler, lies the same fragile truth. Divinity is just humanity, gilded and terrified of death. Caesarion's voice was lost, but his silence changed history. After him, no ruler could claim divine birth without risking rebellion. Rome had learned the cost of killing a god. And yet, the empire that murdered him couldn't resist taking his image, the sun crown, the sacred lineage, the myth of immortal blood, and wearing it proudly. His death became the blueprint for how power disguises itself as holiness. The boy who died screaming didn't vanish. He simply became the face that every empire feared to see in its reflection, the proof that all gods, in the end, are just children trembling in the dark. Centuries passed, and the sands reclaimed everything, the palaces, the shrines, even the tombs. Alexandria, once the jewel of the world, became a ghost city. The waters of the Mediterranean swallowed its edges, and the stories of gods and kings drifted into legend. But sometimes the dead refused to stay buried. In the 19th century, when archaeologists began digging through what remained of the ancient city, they found fragments that didn't belong to any recorded god. A boy carved in marble, with features half Roman, half Egyptian. A serpent coiled around his feet. A sun disk cracked across his brow. No inscription, no name, just an unspoken presence. Scholars debated endlessly. Some said it was a depiction of Horus. Others claimed it represented a forgotten deity. But a few, studying old papyrus fragments and Roman letters, saw the impossible. The same face described in records of Cleopatra's son, Caesarion, the boy who became a god, who died screaming, whose name was erased so completely that even his tomb was never found, now staring back through centuries of silence. And perhaps that's the cruelest truth of all. For every empire that rises, there comes a child like Caesarion, born into power, worshipped as divine, destroyed by the very system that created him. It is a pattern older than history itself. The illusion of divinity is the most dangerous crown a mortal can wear. Because once you convince the world that you are not human, you stop being treated like one. For the priests of Egypt, Caesarion was the living bridge between heaven and earth. For Rome, he was a threat, a heresy made flesh. And for Cleopatra, he was her masterpiece, her final gamble to defy fate itself. In the end, all three were wrong. He was not immortal. He was not divine. He was just a boy, terrified, betrayed, and forgotten beneath the weight of gods. Yet he endures, not in temples or in scripture, but in the spaces between myth and memory. Every time humanity deifies power, every time we mistake bloodlines for holiness, his shadow flickers through the centuries. The echoes of his last cry still hang over every throne built on the bones of a child. If you walk through modern Alexandria, the air still hums with ghosts. The harbor where Cleopatra's ships once burned smells faintly of salt and decay. The old necropolises are sealed, but people say that when the wind blows just right, you can hear something, not words, not voices, but the faint rhythm of breath beneath the earth. Perhaps it's the Nile whispering to its dead. Or perhaps it's the last echo of the boy god, who learned that immortality is not granted by divine blood, but by memory. Because as long as his story is told, as long as someone remembers the boy who became a god and died screaming, Caesarion still lives, not as a god, not as a king, but as the most human of all myths, a child who dared to believe the world could not kill him.